Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 30 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Anaheim Ducks, in which the Sharks have won 6-1. So in the first two games that the Sharks had played against the Anaheim Ducks this season, they lost both of them, and both in a shootout. So here tonight, the Sharks, you could say, get their revenge with a pretty lopsided victory. However, having said that, was this really a good victory to get? You see, earlier on in the season, back when the Sharks were really struggling in those first few weeks, I had mentioned that you can't necessarily expect a team to go 0-82, and so you do have to win some games, and there were certain games against certain teams that you would like to see them get the win against. So for instance, the example that I was using at the time was the Vegas Golden Knights, the Sharks' number one rival, at least back when they were an actual competitive team. It's nice to see them win against Vegas because you want to see Vegas lose. This type of game here against the Ducks tonight was pretty much the opposite. This is a game that you wanted to see the Sharks lose actually going in here because of the fact that the Ducks are literally the only team below the San Jose Sharks in terms of point percentage in the standings. So if the Sharks want to have the best possible odds of getting the first overall pick in the draft this season, they would need to finish below this Ducks squad. So technically this was a 4-point game, and the Sharks winning it does not help their chances in that drafting at the end of the season. But still, the Sharks, obviously for pride reasons, the players obviously are not going to be tanking. They want to win, so they're going to go their hardest, and they managed to get what in the end was a relatively easy win. I know not a lot of people like to say that there are any easy games in the NHL, the parity of the NHL, yada yada yada, but there is a pretty clear and substantial difference between a team like the Boston Bruins and a team like the Anaheim Ducks, and it's just a situation here tonight where while the Sharks did indeed win 6-1, I didn't even necessarily think the Sharks played absurdly well. If the Sharks had played like this against like an actual playoff team, they definitely don't win 6-1, and who's to say they would even win the game at all. But because the Ducks are indeed quite bad, no offense to any Ducks fans, this ends up being a pretty big lopsided victory for San Jose. So this game starts off in the first period with a Timo Meier goal, a very nice pass from Erik Karlsson to make it 1-0 San Jose, and that was the score at the end of the first period. Now, the two previous matchups between these two teams that I said the Sharks lost in shootout were extremely high-scoring affairs. The Sharks lost the first one 6-5, and the second one 5-4. It really goes back to what I mentioned in my previous review, which was that the Sharks had been a pretty high-scoring team, at least as of late this season, and yet their goaltending has been what has failed them a lot of the times and has caused them to really lose a good chunk of their games. And so with just one goal in the first period, it was a question of whether we would see a high-scoring affair once again, but in the second period, things definitely opened up more. The Sharks get a goal from Scott Harrington relatively early on to make it 2-0, and then two very quick goals within 8 seconds of each other from Erik Karlsson and then Nico Sturm to make it a game that was at 1.10 just a few minutes later of game time, 4-0. Zegras would respond for the Ducks to get them back on the board at the very least just about a minute and a half later, 4-1, but that would be the score at the end of the second period, and into the third there really wasn't necessarily that much doing. The Ducks did get a couple of power plays where they looked relatively dangerous and a couple of decent shifts as well. In particular, the goal scorer himself, Zegras, tried to set up some decent plays in the offensive zone, but there really wasn't much doing, and while there was that offensive zone time that I just mentioned, nothing that was necessarily super dangerous for Anaheim. The Sharks kind of shut it down rather well, and as such, no goal ends up getting scored for the Ducks. Eventually, it is Nick Bonino who adds an empty netter as the Ducks surprisingly pull their goaltender in a 4-1 situation, and then even after that, Lorentz scores not on an empty net, and the final score of the game is 6-1. So on to the players to talk about here. We of course have the first line of Meier, Hertl, and LeBanc. Not a superb game from these three players by any means, but they certainly had some very good shifts, as you would of course expect from this top line. Meier has been one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks this season, probably only right behind Erik Karlsson, and so you are expecting him to really perform each and every game, more or less. He gets his 14th goal of the season, which was nice, though it was, I guess, slightly more sort of set up by Erik Karlsson. And then the rest of the line also did some pretty decent things as well. So not a bad game for this first line. On the second line, we of course have Barabanov, Couture, and Bonino. And the first player I do want to talk about is, of course, Nick Bonino on this second line. He now has a third goal on the season in a third straight game. So after going the first 25 games of his regular season without a single goal, kind of similar to what he did last year, he now has managed 3 straight. Is this some amazing turning point for Nick Bonino? Not necessarily. The fact remains there is that he's still not necessarily generating so many chances for himself. It's just that the few chances that he has got as of late have managed to go in for him. So also the secondary benefit of being on this second line with Couture and Barabanov does help in that offensive regard as well here. So there was an interesting stat that they actually showed during the broadcast about Nick Bonino, and that is that he actually led the league in terms of block shots as a forward, which you might look at as a positive and say, wow, look how he's sacrificing the body constantly to keep the puck off of, his own goaltender and things like that. It is also somewhat of an indication of the fact that Bonino is so frequently defending in his own zone that the block shots end up racking up, because of course a player who doesn't have that many block shots doesn't necessarily mean they're a poor, defensive player and isn't fully committed to actually keeping the puck out of his own net. It could also just mean that they're playing so much in the offensive zone that there's never really a shot to block. And so the fact Bonino leads in this category is both a negative and a positive thing. It kind of reminds me of Mario Ferraro. I believe it may have been last season or 2 years ago when he also was tops in the league in terms of block shots, just in general, since of course Ferraro is a defenseman, so he's doing it more often. That was also a sort of positive in that, yes, he's sacrificing the body, but also kind of a negative of, though, he's in that position so much, which isn't necessarily all that great. And so when it comes to Nick Bonino, he is still a player who is going to have to do a lot more to win me over, considering he's already played 100 games with the San Jose Sharks over these past couple of years, and most of them have been quite bad. But when it comes to the other two players on this line, I was also rather impressed with Barabanov. I've been really enjoying him on the first power play unit for the San Jose Sharks. He's kind of like that fifth potential swap position if the Sharks were loading up the top unit, because obviously you'll see Karlsson, you'll see Meier, Hurdle, likely even Couture as well. But that fifth position could have easily been someone like Kevin Labanc, who we do know is a power play specialist. At least he was a few years ago. So Barabanov, we saw him a lot of the times on the second power play unit last season. He seems to have locked down that first spot, and he's doing a very good job in that particular role. On the third line, we once again had just trio of Sturm, Kunin, and Svechnikov. It was a trio that I don't think was necessarily great here. It's kind of disappointing because earlier on in the season we did see some pretty solid chemistry between both Sturm and Svechnikov, but then because of the sort of lineup juggling that found Svechnikov on the top line with Hurdle and Meier for absolutely no reason, and then healthy scratched, they seem to have lost that original magic that they did have, if you could really call it magic. And so at this point, it is a third line that isn't necessarily amazingly effective. Svechnikov was a player who was on waivers just a couple of days ago and completely cleared it, though is now still playing with the main San Jose Sharks roster. And I honestly didn't actually hate that he was in that particular position. If the Sharks actually had a decent player, they do have a decent player to call up, but if the Sharks were actually willing to call up a decent player, I would have put them immediately over someone like Svechnikov, but it seems as though that's not the case here, and the Sharks are only willing to call up players like VL and Sousa. So at this point, we are kind of just stuck with Svechnikov on this third line, and we can only hope that he can return to form of the earlier parts of this season. And then finally, the fourth line, we had Lorentz draw back in after about a 5-minute game from CJ Seuss, just the other one, and it definitely did see an improvement of the fourth line. Prior to Lorentz stepping out of the lineup due to illness, he was probably the only half-decent player on the fourth line. Gadjevich had been looking okay over these past couple of games, I guess, and Lindblom has been mostly invisible, so Lorentz was really the only player who you were like, hey, that guy's not terrible on this fourth line. So him coming back definitely does give a sort of boost to this last line for the San Jose Sharks, and I thought they were definitely okay here tonight. Lorentz getting this goal is obviously nice for him because he's had some okay chances these past few games. I mean, dating back for a pretty long time, I should say, and he didn't manage to capitalize on those, so it was nice to see him here, even though it was in sort of garbage time. Doesn't necessarily matter. A 5-1 game made a 6-1 game. On the defensive side of things, in last review, I talked about Megna on this first pairing, so here tonight, I guess it's only fair to talk about Erik Karlsson, who once again performed exceptionally well offensively. It means a bit less considering it was against the worst team in the league, the Anaheim Ducks, but of course the Sharks are the second worst team in the league, so it's not as though they're completely outmatching Anaheim. And Karlsson made some very nice plays. He had that beautiful assist on the Meyer goal. He had a goal for himself, which is something that we haven't seen in like almost a month's time at this point, off the post and in, which was nice for his 12th of the season, and also just a couple of very nice moves at the blue line to set up some solid offensive zone shifts. He was really, as we have seen many times already this season, he was really the guy drawing up a lot of the plays for the San Jose Sharks offensively, and he continues to rack up the points here. I know there are still a lot of trade rumors swirling around Erik Karlsson at this point. I mentioned this back maybe a few weeks ago, that it's very difficult to imagine a world where Karlsson gets moved mid-season, and I'm still kind of going through that line of thinking, but you never know, and I wouldn't necessarily hate if a trade did happen. And then I also want to once again mention Scott Harrington. I brought up in my Vancouver review that unlike in his previous couple of performances with the San Jose Sharks, where I immediately wanted to see him off the lineup, that in that Vancouver game, he was well enough that I thought he deserved another game, and David Quinn clearly thought the same thing. Harrington gets another look here tonight against the Anaheim Ducks, and while I don't think he was as effective as he was against Vancouver, at least on the offensive side of things, I still thought he was quite good, and he does seem to be a half-decent solution, at least at the moment, against these bad teams like Anaheim and Vancouver, so that the Sharks aren't necessarily missing Mario Ferraro that dearly, though of course they do want him back as soon as possible. And then finally, and perhaps most interestingly, we have the Sharks' starting goaltender for the night, and that is Mäkiniemi. So after he comes in relief of Kaapo Kähkönen, in the third period of the previous game against the Vancouver Canucks, he actually ends up earning the start here, not in a back-to-back type of situation. He earns the start here against Anaheim. Obviously, it's not necessarily, it's like potentially the easiest matchup you could possibly get. It's not as though they're playing him up against like Colorado or Boston or New Jersey or anything like that. They are playing him against the 32nd ranked team, but it is still sort of a telling of trust and sort of faith that they have in that he can sort of show what he can do in this type of situation, because of course Reimer should be returning from injury soon, and there is the big question mark in the air of whether or not Kähkönen is feasible to be a backup goaltender or a 1A 1B type of situation, because Kähkönen has just been so exceedingly bad thus far this season. Now with this performance here tonight, of course it is rather impressive in his first NHL start to have only let in a single goal, but from what I saw, there weren't necessarily that many great chances. There was some shakiness. The one goal that he did let in wasn't necessarily super impressive to let in, right? This was one he definitely could have made the save on Trevor Zegras. And so take those facts combined with the idea that Kähkönen was sort of like a not established starter, but like at least an established NHL goaltender, and Mäkiniemi just playing, complete inexperienced rookie type of player. I am fully expecting Mäkiniemi is the one sent back to the Barracuda, and Kähkönen will resume his duties as the sort of tandem with James Reimer, but it is certainly an interesting wrench thrown into the Sharks situation. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, so a bit of a break here, and they'll go up against the Arizona Coyotes, another team that find themselves right near the bottom of the standing, so we'll see if the Sharks can try and take advantage there as well. Class dismissed.